Welcome to The Riff, where writer and investor Byrne and I discuss the major inflection points caused by technological change. Our weekly conversation covers the obvious and not so obvious ways in which markets and businesses will adapt as a result. Let's jump right in. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Doing great. I saw that you wrote about OpenAI. Most recently, some new details surfaced. What was most intriguing to you?
Well, my attitude towards this situation for a while has been that you should just assume that there's more to the story and it takes a long time to come out because management, their stated reason for kicking Altman out in the first place was that he hasn't been entirely consistent, and then there was that weird blurb from a couple days ago about how the board could not find any specific examples of this because he was just so good at misleading them. But then we did have the one case study of him apparently, like per the board member's recollection, telling some board members that other board members wanted to get rid of another board member, and then that turned out not to be true. Which I don't know. I like if you're Altman's first startup was Looped, and they did these deals with, they were a mobile app, and they were a mobile app at a time when you had to actually do deals with carriers. It wasn't just get your app approved in the App Store. It was actually like get Verizon to want to do this, and that's just a very different proposition. And it is the kind of thing. It's the kind of task that really rewards getting each side to feel like they're the only stumbling block in making this happen, and they will be left behind if it doesn't happen. And I think that habit of being optimistic about achieving your aims is generally a good one, and can always be taken too far. Like there's in one sense, it's just like this. That this is how like a party happens. Is that you insinuate to person A that person B is definitely going to be there, and then person B that person C is going to be there, and then person C that person A is going to be there. And as long as everyone feels like there will be a good guest list, they all want to go. And if you tell someone like, I'm throwing a party and nobody's coming, will you please come to my party? Then it's not going to happen. So yeah, at one level, this is just how all social events happen. At another level, though, it is, or at least how many social events happen. At another level, it's also how Ponzi schemes happen. Is Madoff, like, at some point really believed that he could get very good returns and raise money accordingly, and couldn't get such good returns, and figured if he raises a little more money, maybe he will get, maybe he'll figure something out, and then it all just collapses. So there is this continuum between making something happen and just overcoming natural inertia, and then a Ponzi scheme. And there are a lot of good things in that continuum, and then some very bad things in that continuum. So yeah, like the most recent revelation was about these complicated boardroom politics, and it's hard to interpret because you only have one half of the story, or probably significantly less than one half of the story, because the board also wants to minimize its own liability, and wants to retroactively make their actions look as good as they can look. So they do have an incentive to frame the story in a way that's favorable to them, and then Sam Altman and his camp at OpenAI, they have the incentive to frame it in a way that looks good for them. So like I still think the confidence intervals on what actually happened, who is to blame, it should be really wide. I think there's definitely a version of this story that is, one set of actors was bad actors, and they did something that sabotaged the company, and either made benevolent AI less likely or made evil AI more likely. And there's another version that's just there wasn't really a fit. Like, you had this organization that wants to do one thing, and you have this governance body that has a different set of priorities, and things ultimately came to a head. And when people share certain aspects of the mission, and one of them just has more control over the resources required to achieve that mission, that person is de facto in charge, even if the org chart says otherwise. So it also it comes back to this legal realist way of looking at org charts and looking at social systems in general, is that like whoever actually has negotiating leverage is in charge, regardless of titles. But it's a lot healthier for everyone's title to correspond to what they're actually empowered to do. So like maybe this story would have a happier ending if instead of a board of directors, there was a board of observers, and they had the same level of transparency, but they also knew that they wouldn't be legally liable if they said something that was exaggerated but negative, and so, but also that they don't have as much of a social liability because they can't actually sabotage. Like they can't just shut down the company in service of the mission, or shut down the charity in service of the mission that it's supposed to accomplish. So maybe in that scenario, they complain earlier about this management style and about compartmentalization and whatever social manipulation happened or that they believe happened, and they can't do anything about it, but it does get surfaced, and maybe that actually affects the, again, from like a realist standpoint, like that actually affects Sam Altman's freedom of action. Like if he is actually in the habit of telling people that things are further along than they are, and of hiding certain things from certain people and saying certain things that are aspirationally true but not entirely true just yet, that gets harder if that's your reputation. Like it only works if people actually think that you're being completely level with them. So they might have paradoxically have had more practical power if they had less formal power. And I think that's a good lesson for organizations generally. I think it's good for companies to think about that. That if there's an employee who has a lot of pull with other employees and has particular views, like even if they're not actually, if they're nominally not able to enforce those views, maybe they practically are, and that it's actually better to just accommodate that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, one sort of straw man that was taken from the saga was, the simple narrative for a bunch of people is something along the lines of the board either, was too EA pilled and thought that Sam was acting in sort of danger to their mission, or that either someone was jealous, or that there were, or that they had lost trust in some way, but were unable to say exactly how. Um, but that they eventually reneged and everyone disagreed with them, or all the employees disagreed, and that by doing so, the board members had basically jeopardized the company or the whole, initiative. But another story goes like, did they jeopardize the company or did Sam jeopardize the company? Because there's another world where Sam just took it. He just said, "Okay, I'm off to do my next thing." And I applaud the new CEO, the promotion, and all the employees stay, and the tender offer goes through, and everyone's happy, and we got a new CEO. And Greg, you should stay on the board, this kind of thing. But so I think both are reasonable critiques.
Yeah, I mean, there is just that general conflict theory, or the uncertainty theory of conflict, that you don't actually start a fight. Like a fight doesn't start if it's obvious who's going to win. You don't need to have a fight. You just at some point, Sam just informs the board, "Hey, I find you people annoying, and you can't stop me. So let's just formalize this, and I am replacing all of you with Twitter anons who have EAC in their bio. Have a nice day." So like that's one version, and there's another version where the board says, "Sam, this is not working. We are replacing you with someone else, and that's it." But for there to be an actual conflict, both sides have to think that they have a reasonable shot at winning, and they both have to believe that the other side is overestimating its own odds. Or you can just have people can just get really wrapped up in their egos and feel like this is their one chance to save humanity. And both sides do get to say that in that scenario. Like Sam gets to say, "I'm creating this really important technology that is absolutely necessary for human flourishing, and these people are trying to stop me, and I have to stop them for humanity." And then they could say he's actually creating the apocalypse button, and we can't let him build it and then press it because he will. So yeah, but like even then, they do have to have some view. Like both sides have to have some view that they can actually accomplish something, because otherwise, what is the point of actually fighting? It's just a very loud way to complain about something that you actually don't really play a part in. So I think they both I guess before the firing, they both would have overestimated their ability to get away with things, and then post firing, it looks like board underestimated Sam Altman, both his political skill and employee loyalty to him. And I don't know, Sam had clearly underestimated the board's willingness to fire him before. Like presumably there were things that he did that he knew the board didn't like that he could have done less of, but he assumed he was doing it, right up to the point where it's actually a problem, and it was actually a little bit past the point where it was a problem. So yeah, we've collapsed they've collapsed more uncertainty than the rest of us have. The rest of us just know that the situation will remain confusing for some time.
I do wonder what's in Adam D'Angelo's head. Adam's a good guy. I've gotten to know a bit, but not well enough to to be on the inside of what's of what's happening. And it's one can only wonder. I mean, for him to have participated in some level in what happened, but then also to remain on the board, it seems like he's a little bit the X factor here.
Yeah, and I think another dynamic is that to the extent that you have idiosyncratic views on AI relative to the within AI mainstream, you might also be hesitant to express those views. Like you might try to be in a position where you can either see if things are going wrong or see if things are going right, but might not go right in the right way. But you wouldn't necessarily tell everyone what your full game plan is, because the unfriendly AI thesis, the when people talk about AI as an existential risk, they generally talk about this fully autonomous AI that is just doing things and no human can stop it. But there's this intermediate stage somewhere in the takeoff where humans can stop it. And of course, if you're talking about existential risk as anything other than just a reason you're very depressed, like you're talking about it as something that can be solved. So at some point, we reach a stage where bad things can happen, but there are still humans in the loop who can stop them. And if you are worried about those things, you want to be one of the humans in the loop. So you might actually see people understating their pessimism about the impact of AI, but also you could see other people understating their optimism, because if you're too optimistic, it sounds like you're indifferent to existential risk. And there are people who at least claim to be. There are people who want to build the machine god and have us, shed our flesh prisons or be superseded by our godlike creations. Those people are a distinct minority, and I think that's just a weird anti-human view. But they would also, to the extent that they actually buy into that, would really want to understate that if they were, say, working at OpenAI or working at any of the other labs. It would weird out their colleagues too much. If you are building this thing that is unimaginably powerful and you actually think the best use case is to do horrific acts of destruction, it'd be like if you were working on the Manhattan Project and you were the one saying, I really want to build the atom bomb because I think humans can finally destroy ourselves with this. It would lead to some awkward water cooler conversations. So yeah, I think there's a narrowing of the Overton window within AI research, and they have a wide Overton window. Just you have to be a fairly high variance, high openness to new ideas kind of person to have bet your career on AI when it didn't look like it was going to be as significant as it turns out to be.
Yeah. No, that's well articulated. I want to segue to something else you wrote this past week about the incentives around releasing models. Speaking of AI, we saw Google come out with Gemini, and other big companies, of course, have come out with their own. What do you talk about some of the trade offs here, or what you found interesting?
Yeah, so I think so I always like thinking about lags, and when a decision happens or when something gets announced, it is sometimes fun to think back to how long did someone have to plan for this and what led to it getting done now or what led to it getting released right now. And with AI products, the larger the company that's producing the product, the more likely it is that they have to worry about headline risk and regulatory risk and all sorts of other risks that just aren't relevant to a smaller company. So, if I somehow invented a really amazing AI model and I just hadn't quite fine tuned it to the point that it stopped using slurs, there's obviously risk in releasing that, but there's less risk than if Google releases Gemini and it starts saying horrible things. So they will tend to have like the base model, done, and then they have to spend a long time just stress testing it, red teaming it, all that stuff, and then they have to figure out at what point, like they know they can't get the risk of bad outcomes to zero, but at what point are the risks low enough that the business risk of not launching it means that you do have to just ship it, knowing that there might still be mistakes, it might still hallucinate in important ways, it might say unpleasant things to some users, but it'll just have to roll with it. And one of the things that is a forcing function there is just who else is releasing models of similar capability. So there was a lot of discussion right when Gemini came out about how it does really well on a bunch of benchmarks and outperforms GPT-4. And then you look at the details of those benchmarks, and they picked really specific tasks on which it very slightly outperforms GPT-4. And the implication is that on a like-for-like basis, maybe it's not quite as good, but there's some sense in which it is on many different dimensions significantly better. So like what happens there is that there's like this long lag of actually building the model, and then there's this other lag of doing the work necessary to get the model ready for release, and we're shortening that latter lag. Like it's pretty tough to accelerate a research process, especially a fairly open-ended one, but you can accelerate the release process. And so we've had over the last year a bunch of really exciting AI announcements, but the way to think about them, I think, is that in isolation, there would have been fewer announcements that would have been more widely spaced, not because the pace of fundamental research has necessarily changed that much, but because the urgency to actually get something to market has changed so much. And actually, the Gemini announcement is a case in point there too, where they announced 3 models, and you can use one in Bard, but it's not actually the one that is outperforming GPT-4 and all these different benchmarks. That one comes later, and it has a different name. It's Ultra instead of just Gemini, because people have been talking about Gemini coming for a long time. So you could say, like Google was able to say, "Hey, we released Gemini, the thing that you've been talking about for so long." But what people were also trying to talk about was Gemini, the Google model that's better than GPT-4, and that one is not here quite yet. So we have an announcement, like a release that was earlier than anticipated, and then the announcement implies that the release was also, like, the announcement implies that the the most powerful model was released, but actually that model comes later, and maybe that model is not that much better than GPT-4, or perhaps even underperforms it on more benchmarks once you make those benchmarks more standardized. So like the pace, it's going to be very easy to overstate that pace, and then we will get to the point where all of the stuff that was in the works and being worked on, and being tested and things, has all been released, and then we're back to whatever the just steady state of AI advances is. So 2024 will, of course, be a year when lots of new things come out, but it may actually be a year where there's a comparative deceleration in at least how surprising the announcements are.
Hey everybody, Erik here with a word from our sponsors. Real quick, what's the easiest choice you can make? Taking the window instead of the middle seat, outsourcing business tasks that you absolutely hate. What about selling with Shopify? Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. Shopify powers 10% of all e-commerce in the US, and Shopify is the global force behind Allbirds, Rothy's, and Brooklinen, and millions of other entrepreneurs of every size across 175 countries. Whether you're selling security systems or marketing memory modules, Shopify helps you sell everywhere, from their all-in-one e-commerce platform to their in-person POS system. Wherever and whatever you're selling, Shopify's got you covered. I've used it in the past at the companies I've founded, and when we launch merch here at Turpentine, Shopify will be our go-to. Shopify helps turn browsers into buyers with the internet's best converting checkout, up to 36% better compared to other leading commerce platforms. And Shopify helps you sell more with less effort thanks to Shopify Magic, your AI-powered all-star. With Shopify Magic, whip up captivating content that converts, from blog posts to product descriptions. Generate instant FAQ answers. Pick the perfect email send time. Plus, Shopify Magic is free for every Shopify seller. Businesses that grow with Shopify. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/momentofzen. Go to shopify.com/momentofzen now to grow your business no matter what stage you're in. Shopify.com/momentofzen.
Coinciding with this is sort of Bitcoin's surge, and people are getting excited about crypto again, and maybe there'll be a crypto bull market. Another one. I'm curious if you think that's possible, but or you think it's likely. But I wonder if, even if there is, I wonder if people will get back into crypto in the same way they did on the last bull run, or if it's kind of like, fooled me once, fooled me twice, or if it, in the sense that they won't come back, but less so because the fool me once, fool me twice, and more so actually just because AI is just so exciting and so practical, and so in front of users already, and it's tough for the most talented engineers in mass to switch from something like AI to crypto, which seems more financially oriented, or is somewhat of a mirage in terms of the consumer applications, at least to the same degree. That's the flip side is the argument that, hey, AI is sustaining. So if you want to go work at OpenAI, or I guess that's the only startup, but Meta or something, the only startup that can really compete with some of these big companies, it's going to be harder to start new things off the ground that become $100 billion plus companies. Whereas in crypto, maybe it's more disruptive, and maybe you're creating net new things that could be more massive, and there's more white space. Any reactions to any of that?
Yeah. Like this bull market has been less fun and interesting to me than the last one, but that's what a bull market is made of, is people thinking this is not so amazing just yet, because those are people who haven't bought yet. And once everyone who hasn't bought yet has bought, then you're at the peak, and it's down from there. So yeah, I think my lack of enthusiasm is actually itself bullish. I think you're right that the barriers to entry have gone up massively in AI, and in a lot of booms, you'll have this cycle where the barriers to entry for the core product have gone way up, but the barrier to entry for the peripheral product that uses this core product has actually gone down, because there are now so many competing models and the prices have come down and all that good stuff. But that has actually become a riskier proposition. So if you're building something that is a wrapper on somebody else's API, and they can see the API calls that you're making, and they can also check Crunchbase, like they can just look at who is actually raising a lot of money and getting a lot of usage. And if both of those things are happening, like if the usage is going up, then that's a sign that this is actually an application that customers like. And if the valuation is high, that's also a sign this is an application that investors like. So it becomes a really good sign that you should just launch it yourself, and not let someone else run away with all that market cap. And that does seem to have happened in multiple cycles, with ChatGPT killing off other attempts to build like a more interactive version of an LLM, and then the GPT is theoretically killing off a bunch of different special purpose LLM applications. So yeah, it is really tough. Like if you decide AI is really cool, it is really tough to figure out what you should be doing differently this year, other than buying NVIDIA call options. Like you sort of have to figure out like, could I spend a couple of years actually getting up to the state of the art while everyone else who was already at the state of the art is continuing to advance? Or should I just assume this is a nice tool that will make a lot of things that I do somewhat easier, but that I just don't have a real shot at improving? Um, and then the counter to that is, well, what if you'd said that, in 2016, when Google started talking about how they're really an AI company and have been all along, and when Meta started, or then Facebook started talking about AI more, and other people did, because there was an AI hype cycle for investors in 2016 and 17. People were really, really into it, and companies were really, really pushing that narrative. So if you had decided that it might be too late, but maybe we should get really into AI in 2016, well, by 2023 terms, you would have been a pretty early adopter still. And same thing happens with crypto. When crypto first hit 1,000, or when Bitcoin first hit 1,000, it really felt like, well, that was fun, but the exciting part is over. Surely returns won't be that great from here on out. Yeah, returns turned out to be pretty great from that out, with some bumps along the way. So yeah, turning back to crypto, um, I think to take, so you can look at the current move as a rates anticipation move, and some of it's just a response to lower rates for 10-year treasuries, that they reduce the opportunity cost to owning an asset that doesn't have yield. Crypto is certainly a lot more institutional now. Like there are a lot of the flakier operators did blow up, go to prison, that kind of thing. That's always healthy for the ecosystem. So in some ways, crypto is definitely safer. And we'll see. On Twitter, I now see lots and lots of ads for NFT collections, but it just doesn't. The fact that it is paid marketing and not organic marketing. I just haven't seen anyone bragging about their NFTs yet. So that part of last cycle may not be replicated in the same way. I guess one thing that does make crypto more interesting this cycle is just there's more geopolitical instability. And when people first started talking about Bitcoin, it's this post-crisis environment, and you could feel like there's all this money printing. Maybe this will cause hyperinflation. It turned out not to. There was enough credit destruction to more than offset that. So that wasn't the true risk. But there was also this worry that the system is just falling apart, and you want your assets to be as mobile as possible, and you want yourself to be as mobile as possible. And that actually feels like a more meaningful concern. Like, it feels like there are more parts of the world where you do actually have to worry about things like military conflict and expropriation of your assets and stuff like that. Obviously, inflation is higher, and so the idea of assets with algorithmically defined money supply gets more enticing in that environment. So that I think like it is sort of like a more classic crypto bubble. It's the era of geopolitical crisis that Bitcoiners were kind of betting on in the early 2010s that didn't actually materialize. It has finally materialized, so maybe there is a use case. You still, in that scenario, have this problem that to be long crypto with that as your bull case, you're basically saying, I think a lot more oligarchs will be fleeing to Dubai, and they won't, they'll have so much gold they can't fit it all on their private planes. So they'll have to put it onto, they'll have to turn it into Bitcoin and just take a, encrypted file with them when they leave. So you are still betting on basically some fraction of bad people being able to get away with badness. But you are also betting that government control of the entire financial system is not necessarily a good thing, and that the worse governments get, or the more drastic the action they have to take, the more you want to be protected from that.
Yeah. On the note of sort of crypto ripping at the moment, what do you think in terms of your predictions as to whether we'll have a smooth landing or soft landing, or experience sort of a recession or minor recession, or what are your sort of predictions for the economy, how we'll handle this time?
Assuming you mean the broader economy and not like
Yes.
the crypto economy and the adjacent Lambo dealers and stuff. Okay, yeah. It still seems like the way to bet. Like, the economy had a big shock to the banking sector recently, and the broader economy mostly shrugged that off. The macro numbers still look really good. It's weird to me. It seemed like things should get a lot worse, but we've survived pretty high rates. The housing market doesn't really clear, and so that kind of makes it hard to tell what's really going on. You sort of have this two-tier housing market where new houses get sold by developers. They're subsidizing the mortgage, and they make it look cheaper. So we've sort of moved some of the rates impact onto the home builders, who, since they've already started building these homes, they still have to move inventory. So it's not going to change their decisions on the margin. And then you have a lot of homeowners where they're stuck because their mortgage is too good and they can't move and they can't get divorced, and all of that stuff, because where else will you be able to borrow at 3%? So yeah, we're in a weird economy, but I guess the economy is always in some sense weird, and it just seems like the path of least resistance is this very gradual, big gradual soft landing. But it's just notoriously hard to predict what the economic cycle will look like, because you always have feedback loops that are usually not obvious except in retrospect. And when there's a lot of weird stuff going on, you just don't know. You don't know what will break, and you don't know what will be contained, and you don't know where the ultimate impact would be. Like, when, in 2006 and 2007, actually, people were pretty aware that housing had peaked and that defaults were ticking up rapidly for subprime mortgages. But the popular thesis then, there were subprime companies that had been going, New Century, I think, went into bankruptcy in early 2007. And the Bear Stearns funds collapsed in, I think, March of 2007. But the market didn't peak until November of 2007. So people were well aware that housing had peaked, that there had been a housing bubble. Like, Google Trends searches for housing bubble were already up and then had rolled over and started dropping. They were aware of all of that, but the view was subprime is just not that big a category of the mortgage business. And even if there are defaults, like, the banks are making money elsewhere, and they probably won't run into too much trouble. They'll just have this gradual period where they're taking write-downs on some of the loans they made, and they feel dumb, but they had this nice period of extremely high profits beforehand, so they'll be okay in the end. And then it turned out that the real issue was the financial plumbing, that people were borrowing, doing very short-term borrowings against highly rated credit products that were backed in part or in whole by subprime mortgages. And even if you felt like the average subprime, like if you feel like the average of those average asset in that class was not going to be impaired, if someone was levered 30 to 1 and you think that there are low but now non-zero odds that they will lose 5% of the value of some of their assets, you don't want to fund any of those assets. You don't know which ones are going bad. And if you're in the business of underwriting overnight loans against very low risk products, you don't want to suddenly become an expert on the very deep nuances of credit for these assets and how correlated the assets within these structured products are, et cetera. You don't have time to do that. Whereas you do have time to answer the phone from your usual borrower and say, actually, we're not rolling over that loan. You should find someone else. And enough people did that the market completely seized up. You couldn't trade anything. People really freaked out. And that was actually the 2008 crash, was people not rolling over extremely short-term loans. It was tangentially related to subprime, but was actually this totally different risk factor that was pretty invisible to policymakers.
Yeah. Well said. I want to segue to another deep dive you did this week, which was on McDonald's, and their rewards program and how they're actually a software business. Why don't you, but in kind of a non-obvious way. So why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, so I really like looking into well-run companies that are not tech companies but are increasingly teching up, because a lot of times they know things about consumer behavior and about worker behavior that the rest of us can't fathom, and so they have a lot of this tacit knowledge that they can then encapsulate in their apps and rewards. And so with someone like McDonald's, like their whole thing is that they are this extremely efficient burger manufacturing company. Like you go in, you order a burger, it is always produced according to spec. It's always exactly as fast as you thought it would be. The restaurant is always, acceptably clean and acceptably safe and so on. So you're getting this very, very standardized experience. And then McDonald's is also a manufacturing company in the sense of they're manufacturing new locations. They're finding places where they can plop down another franchise, and it'll get decent foot traffic, and they'll be able to slightly expand their coverage area and sell slightly more Big Macs and Happy Meals. So I think that idea of like the core business is actually more of a business of creating and enforcing standards, and then the actual implementation is done by the franchisees who are, they're in a different business. They actually have to do things like figure out who's showing up for which shift and hiring someone new when their cashier quit or whatever. But McDonald's corporate does not have to think about that stuff. They have to think about the higher level abstractions. So this leads to the loyalty program discussion. So McDonald's had an investor day last week, and when I was reading through the transcript, they talked about their loyalty program and how it's actually one of the largest on earth. I think they said that if you look at people who use the loyalty program at least once in the last year, it has 250 million members, I believe. So like it is on a yearly active user basis, one of the largest consumer facing products out there. And then because they were talking so much about the loyalty program, I looked into it, and it's actually an insanely generous program. So it's something like you get 100 points for every dollar you spend, and you can redeem 15 points for a McChicken, I think. And that typically retails for $4.50 to $6.50. So if you think of it on a return on ad spend basis, if you do the McChicken, which is the one that I checked, you get 30% or so of your money back. And that's crazy. Like, an airline that's going to give you a free flight for every 3 flights you take, or like a hotel where fourth night's free, it would be a very generous program. It would certainly get people's attention. But with McDonald's, part of the order pattern is people buy a meal for their family, and so giving them something free is basically a way to get that incremental foot traffic, and the marginal cost of a McChicken is going to be pretty low. So they, if that free food is actually sold as like it's given away as part of this bundle that actually involves ordering, say, $30 or $40 worth of food, then getting the incremental sale is worth more than the cost of that additional chicken sandwich. And if they have a loyalty program, they have an app, The app has push notifications, so they can do stuff like get people to order ahead. They can have people do different kinds of pickup, so they can control the throughput in their factory and line it up a lot better. They can also do push notifications. So if they know that you have racked up enough rewards, they don't have to tell you right away. They can wait until there is a very slight demand shortfall at one of their locations where they've modeled it out, and the next 30 minutes are going to be unusually slow. They have room for one more customer that, one incremental customer. So they blast out some push notifications, and let's say they know the conversion rate's 5%. So they send them to 20 people. So they get there statistically one more person in the store, and they're getting a little more utilization. And if you think of their average cost, you're thinking of things like the cost of rent and utilities and personnel, but their marginal cost is really just the cost of the ingredients and whatever incremental utilities usage is required to cook them, and then the interchange fees and stuff like that. So the marginal cost of one more meal is really, really low as long as they're operating below capacity. And by having a very generous rewards program and having a bunch of people install the app, they can actually manage that demand around their capacity much more precisely. The other really interesting thing about McDonald's is that they have a long list of operational standards, and they said there's a 5-point revenue difference in stores that are at the bottom versus at the top of compliance with those standards. And I think the average revenue per location is like 4 million. So there's like a $200,000 a year revenue difference. And a lot of that, again, is going to be incremental profit for the restaurants that are actually cleaning the bathroom on schedule, and where the cashier is greeting you in the exact prescribed way, and all of those little details are taken care of, which is, I think, another case of this software like leverage, where you slightly improve things on a couple different axes and a huge amount of revenue drops to the bottom line. The other piece of the McDonald's model I thought was interesting was, like many other companies that own big brands, they are slowly dematerializing and outsourcing all the messy operational stuff to franchisees or to other third-party companies. But with McDonald's, one big part of their operating leverage is that they buy $60 billion a year worth of ingredients and packaging. And every time they expand that number, they have slightly more negotiating leverage with their suppliers. So for them, a new franchise location, it improves their pricing power. And since that's pricing power that McDonald's corporate has, pretty much all of that benefit actually drops to the McDonald's parent company, not to the franchisees. So they are creating this system where other people are doing a lot of the work and a lot of the capital intensive work for them. And then the corporate parent is reaping the rewards. And you've got positive feedback loops with all of these. So the bigger they are as an ingredients buyer, the more margin they can get on their products, and that increases the return on things like having a really nice rewards program and having a denser network of locations and running more national ad campaigns and all the other stuff that they do. So yeah, it turns out to be a really interesting, really well-run business. And I think it's just a case study in the general quality of big companies has gone up a lot over time. Management is a lot more competent, and they're a lot more aware of all the levers they can pull. So it's not the only ingredient in the rise in corporate profits as a share of GDP, but it's definitely a meaningful ingredient that when McDonald's is trying to extract an incremental 10 cents in gross profit per visit from the median McDonald's customer. Like, McDonald's has a lot of really, really big advantages in that area, and their customers have very few. So we've put a lot of human capital and a lot of time into optimizing these systems as a society. Probably 50, 80 years ago, whoever's running McDonald's would have been doing something very different with their time instead. They'd probably be more likely to be in politics or something, and or working for the government, and government would have been more competent then. But maybe the cheap and extremely reliable burgers are actually a good price to pay for diminished state capacity.
While we're on the topic, or in a related topic, you also wrote about the minimum wage, and there's been sort of general thinking over the years has been sort of the libertarian or right-wing argument against minimum wage, which is it leads to unemployment. But Noah Smith and other sort of enterprising, neoliberal economists have argued that actually minimum wage is good for reasons I don't exactly know the calculations that they came up with or how verifiable they are. But I know as a reasonable economist. I'm curious for your perspective on the effective minimum wage, or what you found particularly interesting.
It's hard to model. So the argument for not being too afraid to raise the minimum wage is twofold. One, employers, especially in small towns with limited labor markets, they're like monopsony buyers of unskilled labor. So if they set a particular price, people either take that price or they don't have a job. So in that sense, the minimum wage, like a lack of minimum wage, does mean that market clearing price for labor can get pretty low. And like the employers who almost always have openings are going to be big chains, national brands. They're better capitalized. They can take advantage of temporary dislocations in the labor force. So they are better able to exploit that. And then since there is a cost to finding a new job, if you really want to make, I don't know, you really wanted to make $10 an hour, but you got the job at McDonald's at $9 an hour. Well, now you have less time to interview, so you're kind of stuck at $9 an hour for a while. You also at that kind of compensation, you have less money for gas. You have to think about whether or not it's worth it to drive out to an interview or to drive out to 20 interviews or something. So there is some stickiness there. The other piece of the argument, which I think is really interesting, is that lower wage workers have an extremely high marginal propensity to spend. And they tend to spend their money, their marginal extra money, at the kinds of places that hire other low wage workers. So if everyone at McDonald's gets a raise, it's not like they're all going to be saving their money for the next 10 years so they can afford a trip to Paris. No, they're probably going to be going to Burger King more often, going to the movies more often, maybe shopping more at Walmart or Target, and maybe those stores need to add employees. So you do end up with an expansionary effect if part of what's holding back the economy is just a lack of demand, and if there's latent demand among the lowest paid workers. So there can be these areas, these like weird air pockets in the economy where you raise the minimum wage by X dollars per hour and the value of a minimum wage worker goes up by more than X because there's more demand from those workers. And so they kind of stimulate their area of the economy and make everyone better off. But you have to model a lot of different cross elasticities and marginal propensity to consume and how that propensity changes over time. And you also have to model how businesses react to it. So one version of that minimum wage story is minimum wage goes up, so McDonald's workers have more money. They go to Burger King and they find out that now the price of a Whopper has gone up because Burger King is paying more for labor. So they are spending more at Burger King, but it's because it costs them more to get what they were getting before. And so you end up with this kind of closed loop where not much really changed. So that is, I think in broad strokes, the argument for a higher minimum wage, but it's an argument where it's really tough to figure out what number makes sense. And, you're modeling a bunch of different dynamics that are always shifting. So maybe it's an argument for something like, let's automatically adjust the minimum wage by inflation plus some extra buffer, and we'll just keep doing that until something breaks, like until unemployment for high school graduates starts going up and relative to unemployment for everyone else. You could try something like that. You could try local experiments, and I think that's like one of the big minimum wage papers did look at wages in places that were on the border between, it would have been like New Jersey and Pennsylvania or something. Like there was one state that had a higher minimum wage, raised their minimum wage, one state that didn't, and you could look at the relative effects of workers on both sides of the state line. So not a perfectly controlled experiment, but about as close as you're going to get. So you could imagine an even more complicated policy where you raise minimum wages in some places and you keep them steady in other places, and then you look at the relative outcomes over time and continuously adjust your minimum wage based on that. And then you just have a pretty high administrative burden for a pretty simple policy. I tend to think that the issue with minimum wage is that what you're really trying to do is you're trying to redistribute money to people who have lower incomes and are willing to work. And that's a good cohort. Like you want that cohort to have as low as possible marginal tax rate, ideally probably a negative marginal tax rate at the very bottom of that income distribution. And then you want that tax rate to go up over time as people are in a better position to pay taxes. So I think it comes from a good place, but it's probably simpler and more direct to just do direct cash transfer payments. And I think the other another set of policies to think about there is that if you actually graph the effective marginal tax rate inclusive of transfers, there are all sorts of weird cliffs and valleys and distortions at the lower incomes. In fact, there are ranges of lower incomes where your marginal tax rate is literally over 100%. You're actually, because you get kicked out of some programs and those programs have some cash value. So it's like, I forget what the range is, but it's something like if you get a raise from $20,000 to $22,000, your effective after-tax income is actually lower. And so eliminating things like that, like just having a smoother curve for tax brackets probably does more good on average, especially because you're asking people who often just don't have a great education, may not speak great English. You're asking them to do fairly complicated calculations if you want them to behave economically rationally. And I think we would just live in a better world when they can compare the Walmart offer, which is $15 an hour, to the McDonald's offer that's $14.25, and say, I'm going with the bigger number. Like it seems like a much better calculation to have people making rather than having them try to figure out, okay, but if I no longer qualify for school lunches, then I have to pay for that. And that actually makes me worse off. But wait, not every day. So I have to figure out how many school days there are in a year. And I also have to figure out my confidence that I'll keep this job and so on. It's like, I don't think you want to be in a position where it makes more sense for someone to write a Python script to run a Monte Carlo calculation for their 20K a year job than it would for someone who's making 200. But the reason minimum wage came up was that New York set a minimum wage for delivery drivers, and there's a lot of fog of war there because the delivery companies like to quote their pay in terms of how much do you get paid when you're actively delivering. But of course, you don't spend all of your time actively delivering. So that is the upper bound. If you had a perfectly efficient DoorDash that matched exactly 100% of labor supply to demand, then yes, that would be accurate, but we don't, so it doesn't matter. But New York they imposed a higher wage on those workers. And one of the responses that the delivery apps had was they actually moved tips out of the main checkout flow and turned them into something closer to an optional thing. And presumably their thinking was that, or their observation is, tips encourage workers like the tips, but tips discourage customers. So you need to have enough tips to encourage workers to actually deliver if they otherwise wouldn't be making enough money for it to be worth their time. But if it's going to be worth their time no matter what, then the tips are just going to reduce conversions. And the tips can actually, in that scenario, actually make the workers worse off because these delivery jobs are now pretty good jobs for the people who are looking for those jobs or considering those compared to other jobs. Like the fixed pay is pretty high for that category. So really, once that's the case, then the socially optimal thing is maximize the number of those jobs, and the way you do that is maximize demand. The way you do that is you reduce tipping as a barrier to completing orders. So in the end, systems equilibrate. Like if you raise the minimum wage too much, everyone eventually acknowledges there is a minimum wage at which everyone gets replaced by a robot. We can debate exactly where that is. We can debate what the cadence is. We can even debate things like, at a higher minimum wage, one of the things that makes sense for companies to do is to actually think much harder about worker utilization. So if you set like a $25 minimum wage, maybe McDonald's says, okay, the math works if literally every minute that you are not processing a customer order, you're mopping a floor or doing, tidying up or doing something else. So you actually increase the number of hours worked, but you might keep the wage kind of constant as a dollars paid versus hours spent actively working. And you just change it to this job where someone is always on and they're working nonstop, sort of like the Amazon warehouse setup. So Amazon could do that because they have a warehouse. They have this constant flow of products coming in and out, and they're sensitive to latency, but they're sensitive to latency on maybe like the hourly and daily scale, but not on a tighter scale than that. So they can actually try to totally optimize their workforce and get everyone working maximally hard all the time. But it raises the returns on really close supervision of workers. It means that using AI and facial recognition to actually spot someone who took a 20-second break to check their messages on their phone, like that becomes high return at a sufficiently high minimum wage. So you the equilibrium gets maintained in this kind of darker, more dystopian world. Whereas I think a happier equilibrium is that the people who are working at McDonald's, they're not making much per hour, and they're getting a monthly check that helps them out, and those wages fluctuate based on the supply and demand for that kind of labor.
I want to segue to two topics that have been a bit hot this week, and maybe we'll close with them. So one is the sort of what's happening in universities right now, and then the other was this is much more provincial, but the EAC, community and doxing. On the universities, what I find particularly interesting is that so first it's we're seeing Bill Ackman basically do hostile takeovers of these universities. We're talking since we're speaking at a time where only the Penn president has resigned, but it looks like others might soon by the time this is released, and it seems like it's working. Like this seems like the most effective kind of donor activism we've ever seen, and people have been complaining about college campuses for a long time. And it's interesting that it's less that for the free speech advocates are finally winning, and in fact, what's really happening is Jews got added to the progressive stack. You can't speak as directly maybe as I can when I say that, but it's just ironic. And so you have the Jonathan Haidts, the classical liberals of the world saying, no, we're just this is kind of like two wrongs don't make a right. Like we're continuing to sort of restrict speech and cancel people, but just in a different direction. Like the people who were doing the canceling before are now getting canceled. But it's interesting that kind of the activism is working. It's rare that we've seen it, and you would have thought it would come from a different direction, but it's interesting to see how it happened this time.
Sometimes if a company takes some political stand that I don't like, I consider just, angrily not buying the product. And then I think to myself, this is just noise. It's not, no one is going to notice this. No one is going to try to figure out what's going on. And even if they did, will they actually notice that this was in response to a specific thing they did? Like maybe if I write them an angry letter, but they get angry letters from crazy people all the time if they're just a sufficiently big company with name recognition. So that too is pointless. And what I think was going on with the colleges was there's this long period where the donors we're mostly pretty annoyed with the direction things are going in, but there's no one event that makes them say we've had enough. And there was one event that actually made a bunch of them say, yeah, we've had enough. And there was this cascade where the heads of colleges are all talking to Congress and explaining their views, and it's when they tried to explain why they did what they did that it just became untenable. So it was one thing to say, they have some kind of wacky beliefs, and they sort of have to keep their charges happy, and that maybe it's better to have a campus where the school periodically says some kind of crazy things, but that keeps the students from rioting or whatever. But once they are actually explaining that no, they really believe this, and explicitly advocating for genocide is actually this free speech issue, but they've also been pretty waffly on other more innocuous kinds of free speech. At that point, everyone can start getting together, and Ackman can call his friends and say, you're also never donating to them again until this person gets fired, right? And their friend says, of course. So once it becomes salient, everyone acts in concert. Long term, I don't know, because I don't know how you would set up a system where they don't drift in that direction, and where they actually have to articulate some kind of principled, values neutral view of free speech. Because ultimately, you don't really have a principled, values neutral view of free speech. Like we are in a country that used to belong to other people and does not anymore. So we have to say that there's some level of taking somebody else's land and putting your own stuff on that land that we are just choosing to live with, that we don't necessarily think was a really good thing, but was not the kind of thing we're going to undo. So we're always choosing what actual limits make sense. Like I think intellectually, like you would think that a college should be a place where you can say just about anything, but no one has the same definition of just about. And so you either have to have some kind of standard where you say that we are explicitly committed to tolerating the kind of speech that we think is actively bad, nobody should ever say, but the principle of letting people say it is more important than that. Or you start coming up with concrete rules. Maybe the schools try to have a different set of rules that they use to differentiate themselves, and that that could be interesting too, but the interpretation of those rules is also going to get really tricky. So you're really pushing back what is this fundamental problem that it's hard for people to get along. We all have varying views, and there's also this tendency for people to form a bubble, and within that bubble, it's very high status to believe certain things, and that means it's higher status to believe the more extreme version of that thing. And if you spend a bunch of time in that bubble and then you try to have a conversation with a normal person about that issue, you suddenly find yourself saying wildly outrageous things all the time because they were closer to in-jokes or signaling within your group for a while, or maybe there was something that started out as this sort of exaggeration that was more poking fun at how extreme the group is, but it actually turned into the group's doctrine. I really like the concept of just not being in on the joke, where the first generation to do something, they're doing their thing and they're exaggerating how cool it is, and the next generation doesn't realize that was an exaggeration. They think it's the real thing. I think we saw this actually with crypto, where people would talk about crypto being this thing that's going to topple all governments, and for a while it was kind of a jokey thing, and then some people decided that crypto is in fact going to topple all governments and is going to just end, and it's going to impose some kind of anarcho-capitalist system on the world. It's totally impossible to resist. I think I guess it's like logically possible, but for the most part, that was an exaggeration that some people took a little too seriously. So I think my main takeaway is that I'm so glad I'm not running a college right now. I think that thought usually doesn't occur to me, but right now it feels like you're going to be hated by a lot of people no matter what. I personally would have chosen to be hated by a different cohort of people for espousing a different set of values than that, but I can sort of see how this thing emerged, even if I really can't relate to what they ultimately thought was the right standard of conduct. But I also think colleges, they have good brand names. They have name recognition. It still is viewed as this important rite of passage, like it is how you go from being a kid in a school to being someone who can take on adult responsibilities and have an adult job. But it doesn't have to be that way. And it is getting easier for younger people to start things outside of the college system. It's getting much easier to learn things outside of the college system. And it's getting easier to find people who want to learn the same things that you do. So I feel like I've been in online reading groups, for example, and I felt like the quality of questions was much, much better than I had seen in college classes. And even if the analysis, even if the average person in the reading group, myself included, is not necessarily not as capable as the theoretical average Harvard graduate is, if the Harvard people are really, really talented and they're doing the bare minimum, and in your online reading group that meets on the weekends, everyone is actually really excited to dig into the readings and they have really fun and fruitful debates, that's actually a better environment, even if the SAT score cutoff is not so insanely high. So I think that is probably closer to the future of learning, that you will find your peer group. It will be this organic peer group. It will be much more intellectually diverse than what you'd find in a typical college classroom. It won't be as selective, but you'll actually find that the selectivity, it eventually selects from people who really, really felt like it was their life's mission to improve their SAT scores. And those people, they're really good employees. If you can find them, you can give them what seems like a lot of money to them. You can give them a really impressive title. They do their thing, but they don't really do their thing. They do your thing, and you can get them to do it well. But yeah, I think the schools are selecting against agency pretty hard right now, and the high agency people are doing other things, and those other things are going to be the things that matter.
Let's wrap on that. Byrne, always a pleasure. Until next time.
Yes, indeed. Great chatting.
Thanks for listening to The Riff. Please go follow and subscribe, give us 5 stars, and check out Byrne's excellent newsletter, The Diff, if you haven't already.